You've possibly heard about it. You might have read about it, usually in today's political world, or you might know someone that's being affected. It affects many people throughout this country. It could be possibly happening right now in your city. I know it's happening in your state, and even might be affecting your neighbor. And what I want to talk to you today is about eminent domain. And what eminent domain is basically is the power uh, for the state to take private property for the use in a public project in return of reasonable compensation. Now, mind you, reasonable compensation is defined in terms of fair market value of the property. And just about everyone knows that under this process, the government can and does seize private property for the public use. So it can seize this private property to possibly build roads, schools, also courthouses. In the city that I work in, we are currently going through this process, and eminent domain is being taken, is being used right now, trying to seize property for a service road. And it is affecting quite a bit of our citizens, and people feel very strongly about it. It can benefit those that live in the city. For our city, for instance, what we're doing is it's being done for a service road. There was no service road there, so now it's currently being used to create a service road. So it does benefit everybody, but it can also affect some. And unfortunately, those with that private property can definitely be affected. Now, since our country was founded, private property has served as a cornerstone of our freedoms. And we know that in the Declaration of the Colonial Rights, the First Continental Congress explicitly stated that Americans are entitled to life, liberty, and property. And they have never ceded in any sovereign power a right to dispose of either without the consent. Now, the government has repeatedly cited the Takings Clause as a justification for taking private property without the landowner's consent. Although this practice is known as eminent domain, it has occurred since the early days of this country. And the government has been restricted for taking private property, except when required, for the public good. Like I mentioned, roads, schools, also courthouses, or things that the public could benefit from. However, the Supreme Court did make a decision in 2005 that basically undermined the protections afforded by the Takings Clause and greatly expanded the government's power to seize private property. And what the government is basically saying is that now we can seize your land, so we can take this land justified. And by taking this through eminent domain, the government can utilize eminent domain to seize your property whenever the government deems it necessary for economic development. So if the government decides to undertake an economic development project, the government can seize the family-owned farm, for instance, and sell the property to a private developer to build a new factory, for instance. And under the banner of economic development, all private property is vulnerable to being taken and transferred to another private owner. And, we have to kind of question ourselves now, is this really what our founding fathers had in mind when they drafted the Fifth Amendment? Was this something that they had in mind? You have to think about that. But did you know that the government has been doing this process, and cities across the country have been using eminent domain to force people off the land so private developers can build more expensive homes and offices that will pay more property taxes than the buildings they're replacing. So what it comes down is tax dollars. And under the eminent domain, the government, like I said, buys the land and then they sell it to a private developer. And many people have had this happen to them. And there's two attorneys, Dana Berliner and Scott Bullock, are attorneys at a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Justice. And this is what they had to say about it. It is fundamentally wrong and contrary to the Constitution for the government to take private property from one private owner and hand it over to another private owner, just because the government thinks that person is going to make more productive use of the land. Everyone knows that the private property can be taken for a road, but no one thinks that the private property can be taken to give it to their neighbor or to a large business down the street for their economic benefit. And people are shocked when they hear that this is going around in the country. It's definitely shocking to hear that it is going on, and how it can affect not just those that are living there, it can affect the neighbors, it can also affect the cities. And we really have to think about about how this can affect us positively or negatively. And the power to take this property through eminent domain is frequently abused by the government for unnecessary and unreasonable purposes. This practice harms landowners by forcing them to expend their valuable resources and to simply keep the property they have owned for decades. This is inherently unfair to hardworking Americans. And eminent domain takings are especially concerning in the context of urban renewal, and it can definitely victimize the poor, racial minorities, and the politically weak. This was something that a law professor at George Mason University spoke about, and he's saying that transferring property to private interests for economic development can affect those that are weaker, and unfortunately the minorities and poor neighborhoods can be greatly harmed by this. And as Americans, we must not be complacent when the government infringes on our individual liberties and restricts our constitutional rights. We must ensure that the government is kept in check and does not overreach the limitations placed on its power, and that serves the interests of the people rather than big government.